Good evening, night walkers. How are you holding up? If you're new, welcome. If you're back, we kept your seat and left the lamp low. Take a breath with me. Shoulders down, jaw unclenched, water within reach, volume where the neighbors won't mind. Good. You're listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we greet you properly, ask how you're doing, and hold the light steady while a darker kind of testimony speaks. We'll think together gently. We'll keep you company. Tonight we're in Lisbon, where stairways stack like ribs and voices travel farther than they mean to. In a small museum off the Alfama, a 19th century boudoir doll sits behind glass. Silk dress brown to tea, eyes that pick a corner and keep it. Weeks ago, during a charity auction, someone joked, "Ask the doll if these lots are real." Laughter, then a shiver. The head turned with a dry click and settled on the auction's evaluator. The room went quiet. He smiled, denied, poured more Vinho Verde. At dawn he was dead in a side street, teeth cracked, tongue dark. Since then, whenever that same circle gathers, collectors, a conservator, a priest who blesses estates, the doll chooses an angle, turns, someone lies, and the city earns another body. Before we go on, check yourself again. Comfortable? Present? If your day was loud, let it drain to the edges. We are not here to rush. Our investigator believes in clockwork more than curses, but she has learned to listen when a room refuses to joke. She will test the case for magnets, the head for hidden bearings, the gallery for microphones that favor a certain register. She will ask who profits when a lie is punished, and why Lisbon keeps teaching us not to say things we do not mean. If the doll is only a machine, we'll prove it. If it's more, we'll still take a statement. Ready? If the head moves, watch the chin, not your fear. It always points to something, even if the hand that wounded is long gone. Part 1, Glass Case, Dry Click. The Casa de Alfama collections opened to a courtyard of blue tiles and shadow. Morning light climbed a staircase, hesitated at a frosted door, and spilled into a gallery that smelled of old fabric and wax. Detective Inês Amaral paused on the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The room was small, the kind that makes whispers sound like decisions. She counted cameras, exit signs, and faces. 2 guards and a curator stood near the back. A conservator in a gray smock waited by a plexiglass case. Everyone spoke in the hush of a place that keeps its voice under glass. The doll sat inside the case in a chair of gilt that had lost its shine. Its silk dress had the color of oversteeped tea. Porcelain arms lay on a lap made careful by a century of display. The head was slightly turned toward a corner, as if it preferred to watch the room through the reflection rather than directly. Inês looked at the eyes and felt watched anyway. She introduced herself and showed her identification. No one asked to see it twice. The curator spoke first. He had the patient face of a person who has guided too many donors through the difference between valuable and pretty. "We have had 3 deaths after gatherings here," he said. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds like a pattern," Inês said. "Tell me what people saw." "They were speaking," said one of the guards, a woman with careful posture. "Each time the head made a sound like dry paper. It moved to face someone. Later, that person was found dead. Between the moment and the death, there was nothing you could point to. Just the look, and the room going quiet." The conservator nodded. She had a camera phone in a sealed pouch, the kind that makes even a tool feel guilty. "I work on textiles and wood, not porcelain. But after the second death, I looked at the case. There are arcs on the inside face of the glass. Here, and here." She pointed through the plexi. Fine scrape marks curved like faint smiles at different heights. The arcs were not scratches made by a person cleaning. They were short, shallow strokes centered where a chin or cheek would touch when the head came to rest. Inês bent and looked along the surface to catch the light. The marks ran through the dust in clean half-moons. They were recent. "How many people had access to the gallery after hours?" Inês asked. "And how many keys exist that open this door and the case?" The curator produced a clipboard and a tight smile. "Entry keys. For myself." The conservator, Rita, for her work. 2 guards for security rounds. The case keys are logged separately. 2 are in the strong drawer. One was signed out by me for the auction night. That is the night of the first turn. Let us inventory every key now, Inês said. No one leaves. I will also need your alarm logs, staff schedules, and any footage that shows this room in the last month. We seal the gallery until I say otherwise. The guards slipped into their roles with the relief of people given an order to hold. The curator began to make calls. Rita, the conservator, kept her hands folded and watched the doll as if it had asked for quiet. Inês circled the plinth. The case sat on a wooden column with a brass plate that named the donor and the year the museum acquired the doll. The plate had been polished recently. The plinth had a discreet access panel with 2 screws that were not original. Along the baseboard, an extension cord ran to a wall outlet. The cord was old and stiff, wrapped with a bit of fresh tape that had no dust. Wiring for the case lights, the curator said when he noticed her looking. We installed it years ago. The bulb is cold now. Photographs first, Inês said. Then we open nothing until we have a plan. She worked the room the way she worked most rooms that held trouble and careful people. Overall shots first. Corners. The door handle with the scuffs that show hurried hands. The reflection in the glass that sometimes gives you the ghost of whoever came close. The scrape arcs again from 3 angles. The baseboard line where the extension cord kissed the wall. The floor around the plinth, clean because the place was proud, but with a single thread of silk near a leg that might matter later. Tell me the order of the last gathering, she said while she photographed. Who stood where? Who spoke? When did the head move? Rita answered. We were in a circle. The curator, the priest, 2 collectors, the evaluator who later died, and me, the guard outside the door. We spoke about condition reports and provenance. Someone joked about lies. The evaluator laughed. Then there was the sound. It is like a dry click. The head turned. It did not whip. It arrived. Faced him. He blushed and smiled and said something about trusting him. He poured wine for people and said no one should be so serious. We cleaned up. The next morning he was dead. The dry click, Inês said. Once you hear it, you do not forget it. Rita nodded. You wait for it without wanting to. That is the part that feels like superstition. Waiting for a sound that might be a gear, or something else. Inês took more photographs. She kept her body between the group and the case to see if anyone learned where she looked. People watch investigators for clues about fear. She had learned to give them process instead. The deaths happened away from here, she said. But the turn happened here. The arc marks say the head makes contact with the glass. The door lock is not damaged. Your case keys exist. Your door keys exist. Your alarm logs will show entry and exit. That means we test for 2 paths. A hand that moved the head when no one looked, or a mechanism that moved the head when someone wanted it to. The guard at the door shifted her weight, then stilled again. Do you believe in curses, detective? I believe in people who want results, Inês said. And I believe that rooms tell you what they were used for if you let them. This room was used to make a quiet sound into a loud decision. She asked for the case key and did not use it yet. She photographed the screws on the plinth panel with a ruler for scale. She photographed the brass plate and its tiny recent scratches where a small tool had slipped. She photographed the cord again, then knelt and took a single still of the dust line beneath the plinth. The dust broke in a clean rectangle where someone had pulled the plinth inches away and pushed it back. The break was sharp. The cleaning staff had not moved it. Someone else had. Who installed that cord? She asked. Do you have the work order? The curator looked at his clipboard again and shook his head without looking up. It was done during a temporary exhibition 2 years ago. The contractor was the same who does our cameras. We will speak to him, Inês said. For now, no one touches the cord. She walked the perimeter and looked up. The crown molding carried a narrow rail for hanging frames. It also carried old dust. At one spot above the case, the dust was thin. A recent ladder had left a mark against the paint. She noted the mark and kept moving. A ceiling vent breathed softly. The room, for all its gentleness, had a way to listen if someone had given it ears. When the photographs were done, Inés had the guards log the keys into evidence envelopes and seal the gallery door with a paper stripe and a signature. She asked for a ladder and a voltage detector and a small insulated screwdriver. She did not open the plinth yet. She did not want to announce curiosity before she could answer it. She had learned that the first opening tells the story of the last person who closed a thing. If she hurried, she would hear her own hands more than theirs. Rita hovered with the careful tension of a person who needs to be useful and is afraid of being accused. "I can help with handling the object," she said. "If we open the case, I can cradle the head without stressing the next spring." "We will do that," Inés said. "But not yet. First we photograph the wiring route to the plinth. Then we make the case safe for handling. Then we look inside while the camera records everything we do." She took one last look at the doll. The eyes were not alive. They were glass, dark at the edges where the paint had pooled. The mouth was a little open, not enough for a word, enough for a breath that would never come. The angle of the head suggested attention. It always did. That was the trick. You fill the silence with your guilt, and then the room returns it to you with interest. Inés wrote the first line of her report in a small notebook that did not require a battery. She wrote in simple words that she could defend later. Gallery sealed. Case shows recent contact arcs. Plinth likely moved in the last month. Non-original wiring present. Keys accounted for at time of seal. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her coat. "If the head moves in this room again," she said to the group, "it will be because either a gear turns or a hand tells it to. We will test both." She stepped back from the case and the doll watched nothing at all. The room waited. The light on the tiles in the courtyard shifted. Somewhere a tram bell rang and faded along the hill. Part 2, porcelain, bearings, and wires. They brought a ladder and a rolling cart. Inés set the camera on a tripod and clipped a small light to the cart's handle. The crown molding above the case had collected years of slow air. Up close, the thin patch she had noticed was obvious. Someone had laid a tool or a small sensor there and lifted it again in the last few weeks. She took 3 photographs with a scale card in frame, then moved back to the floor. "Rita," she said, "walk me through safe handling for the object." "The case seals are intact," Rita said. "We unlock with opposing keys so the lid does not twist. I can lift the lid with you and set it on the cart. I will then cradle the head at the jaw and occipit to avoid stressing the neck spring. We support the torso under the arms. We do not rotate the head until we know how the ring is seated." The glass room had gone even quieter. The 2 guards stepped to the corners and faced out. The curator stayed near the door and looked older than he had looked before. Inés checked the voltage detector at the outlet. It murmured a safe tone. She photographed the condition of the cord one more time, then nodded to Rita. They broke the seals, logged the time, and turned the case keys together. The lid rose with a sigh and a faint squeak from a hinge that no one had oiled in a decade. They set it on the cart's padded top. The air inside the case had the dry scent of old starch and a shadow of linseed that came from the dress's conserved threads. "Hands," Inés said. They both drew on thin nitrile gloves. Rita reached in with a care that had been practiced until it was almost stillness. She cupped the porcelain head. Inés slid a hand beneath the small shoulders and the upper torso. The doll weighed more than a toy and less than a body. The silk scratched softly against Rita's wrist as they lifted. "Hold," Inés said. She peered at the neck. A narrow brass ring lived between porcelain and cloth. It was seated inside a felted collar that came away in the mind as a neat trick. The ring was not original to the 19th century, but it was old. The patina was honest. A sliver of polished metal showed on the ring's inner edge where contact had been fresh. Rita breathed out. "Gimbal," she said. "It allows tilt in more than one plane. The spring is underneath. You can see the coil if I lift the chin a touch." She did, barely. Inés saw a spiral of darkened steel that had once given the head a gentle return. The spring held tension, but not much. The ring could have been added during a repair long after the doll was first made. There was no sign of modern magnets near the head. No obvious pattern wire in the neck. The trick, if there was a trick, was lower. Back to the chair, Inês said. They set the doll down. Inês took close photographs of the ring, the felt, and the seat where the head met the neck. She then crouched at the plinth, framed the access panel, and loosened the two bright screws that did not belong to the rest of the wood. The panel came away. Inside the cavity, where one might expect only a wooden cross brace, someone had built a shallow chamber out of thin composite board and painted it the color of dust. Inês clicked on the cart light and slid it close. There was a motor no bigger than a walnut, mounted on a small aluminum bracket. A steel rod rose from its horn through a guide bushing and disappeared into the base of the doll's chair. The motor's housing wore the ugly pride of a hobby part. A cheap sticker with a part number peeled at the edge. Wires from the motor ran to a circuit board that wore its own sticker in a language of catalogs and online stores. The board fed a stack of cells taped together with black cloth tape. A small antenna lead curled like a last thought. Rita made a soft sound in her throat. That does not belong to any preservation plan. No, Inês said, but it belongs to our pattern. She photographed everything before she touched anything. Board, battery, and wire. Zip ties. Glue thumbprints. The rod and its guide. The bushing had left a faint rub mark inside the hole. Someone had bored it with a tool from a different trade than conservation. There were wood shavings in the corner of the cavity. They were pale and new. The circuit board carried a line of header pins and a slot for a removable memory card. The slot held a card the size of a fingernail. Inês handled it with tweezers and slid it into a small reader from her kit. The reader's lamp winked when she connected it to a forensic tablet. She did not open the files yet. She photographed the screen as it showed counts and dates. 3 files, she said. 3 timestamps in the last month. Rita swallowed. 3 nights. Inês nodded. She also photographed the battery pack and the bit of solder that had dripped at one corner of the board. Whoever had installed this did not do a clean job, but they had done a serviceable one. The antenna's thin wire ran to a small daughter board with a printed spiral. A label on that board said 2.4 gigahertz. The radio was the same kind found in a cheap toy car. Receiver, Inês said. It listens and turns voltage into movement. The motor turns the rod. The rod travels up through the chair into the torso and couples to the neck ring. It does not need to be elegant to move the head enough to touch glass. She traced the extension cord. It fed a junction hidden behind the plinth. The junction split power between the board inside the plinth and a small transformer for the case light. The board could run on the battery alone. The cord would keep the battery topped when the gallery let it. A person could also pretend the cord only fed the light and ignore the rest. The torque log sat inside the memory card as 3 rows of simple text when she opened one file. Each row started with a time and ended with a number of steps. There were no names, just counts. She did not need more to set the bones of a story. 3 activations. 3 arcs on the glass at slightly different heights. 3 bodies. She stepped back from the open plinth and looked up at the crown molding again. If someone had stood on a ladder with a small remote there, they could have seen the circle of people below, waited for a sentence to sound like a dare, and sent the command. The doll would do the accusation. The room would fall silent. The rest would happen elsewhere. Rita leaned over the cart. "Look at the felt under the ring," she said. "It is indented here and here. Those are stops. 45 degrees to one side, 90 to the other. Whoever coupled the rod to the ring set expected angles." Inês photographed the indentations. The felt was worn at 2 positions in ways that could not be explained by casual touch. The person who had practiced with the mechanism knew where to land the head so the chin kissed the glass in a reliable spot. They knew what a turn looked like to a crowd. Inês closed the tablet and logged the card into an evidence envelope. She did the same for the access panel screws, the little composite shavings, and a flake of glue from the motor bracket. She did not remove the mechanism yet. She wanted it to sit unimproved for a while longer and tell her if it had other secrets. "Who on staff would have known how to do this?" she asked. "Who has hands for electronics and the patience for small work?" The curator named the security contractor. "Tomas does our cameras and the entry pads. He knows how to hide wire. He is careful when I am watching him and less careful when he thinks I am not. Who else? Inês said. Vasco, Rita said, almost under her breath. He is the owner. He calls himself a gallerist. He had a period when he bought lights and small motors for installations. He wanted to stage breath in a portrait. He showed me sketches with rods and hinges. None of it was funded, so it stayed in the drawer. Inês made a note of the names. She then had Rita help her return the lid and reseal the case. They left the access panel off and taped the opening with a dust cover. The plinth was now a box with a visible truth peeking out. That was enough for the day's first step. 3 activations, Inês said. 3 turns to frame 3 lies as target practice. Someone installed a remote head. Someone stood within sight and made it move when the moment felt right. The guard at the door shifted again. If we know that, what about the deaths? The mechanism points. It does not kill. It does not, Inês said. It gives permission. We will find who used the permission and where they were when each body fell. She unplugged the extension cord from the wall and logged the act. She wanted the board to sit cold with whatever residual charge it held. She wanted the person who cared about the battery to wonder whether it would still be ready the next time they called for a turn. Outside the gallery, the corridor carried the slow footfalls of visitors and the distant rattle of a cart down a service hall. Lisbon moved through its day without caring about the small machine in a wooden box. Inês stood still and listened to the room breathe through the ceiling vent. Somewhere in the small chamber under the plinth, a cheap motor sat quiet and waited for a signal that would not come. We will speak to Tomás, she said. We will speak to Vasco. We will look for receipts. We will ask to see the drawer that holds the sketches. But first we map everyone who kept meeting here after hours, and we learn who believed the turn and who pretended not to. Rita glanced at the doll one more time. When the head moves, it sounds dry, she said. Like paper. I told myself it was the spring. That was easier than feeling watched. It is the spring, Inês said. And the rod. And the motor. And the person who wanted the room to believe the rest. She signed the seal across the door again, then turned to the curator. I want your after-hours event logs for the month. Names of all attendees. I want the company name for the contractor and a copy of the last invoice. We will also need the maintenance records for the crown molding rail. If a ladder hung there recently, someone will remember. The curator nodded. I will get them. Inês touched the notebook in her pocket and felt the line she would write. Mechanism present. Motor and radio receiver installed within plinth. Steel push rod through seat into torso. Memory card with 3 activation logs matching dates of 3 deaths. She would keep the words simple again. She would keep them clear enough to carry across a courtroom and cold enough to carry back into this room when they returned. She looked once more at the felt under the ring and the way the worn places made a map of angles. People build their rituals into things by accident. That was the comfort and the flaw in most tricks. If you looked long enough, you could see where the hand had trained the object to do what it did. Part 3, the circle that kept meeting. Lisbon's late afternoon had a color that made stone look warm. Inês walked from the museum to a cafe whose windows took the last light like it was a story it had been told before. She picked the corner table with a view of the tram line and set out a narrow notebook, a small stack of forms, and a paper map of the Alfama with pencil marks that were turning into patterns. She did not like digital boards for first passes. Hands remember the drag of a pencil where a screen pretends there is no friction. She wrote the names and underlined the dead. Miguel Bessa, Duarte Pino, Sister Helena. Each name had a thread drawn back to the Casa de Alfama collections and a note about the night each had smiled under the doll's turning head. A waiter brought a glass of water and left the silence alone. Inês breathed the quiet the way a diver takes one more slow inhale before the drop. Rita arrived first, a folder hugged to her chest like a life vest. She looked at the map, at the lines drawn between places that had never met before she worked here, and she sat without the small talk people used to make investigators seem like friendly neighbors. These are the after-hours lists, she said. We keep them in a simple book at the desk. I photographed each page with the date and the names you asked for. I also printed the copies because I know you like paper to start with. Thank you, Inês said. She took the pages and slid them beneath the map. Tell me about the circle that kept meeting. Rita's hands stayed near the folder even after it was empty. It started as a donor club, casual, talks with wine, a place to show a textile we had cleaned or a piece of carved wood under safe light. The owner likes to be seen as a host. That is Vasco. He has charisma in the way a flame has temperature. It is pleasant until you feel it as a warning. Who came most often? Inês asked. Always Vasco, often Father Alvaro. He says he blesses estates and calms old furniture so families feel better about letting things go. Ana Mora, the insurance adjuster, because she is called when people want to make paperwork line up with hope. Tomas, the security contractor, because he sets up small shows and likes to say he is part of the art. And me, because I work there and because someone needs to stop people from touching things. Inês wrote the names again, this time with the roles in parentheses. Owner, priest, insurance, contractor, conservator. She added a simple phrase above the cluster. Off-the-record accusations. She could feel the shape of the room at those gatherings now. Chairs carried in and placed in a circle near the doll's case. Wine poured like permission. Jokes about truth that slid into little trials. Talk to me about the dead, Inês said. Not the crimes. The people. Rita sat back and looked toward the tram without seeing it. Miguel Bessa had a smile that promised he could make your purchase feel like a discovery. He had a reputation for being lenient with reality when reality got in the way of a sale. He called it optimism. Others called it fraud when they were out of earshot. He laughed often. The night the head turned toward him, he laughed again, as if the room belonged to his charm. He poured more wine, and I thought, for a moment, that he might believe he had made the doll his ally. Duarte, Inês prompted. Duarte Pinu was a collector who liked to say he had a good nose and no patience for fakes. He also liked to borrow against his pieces and then act surprised when the bank called. He had debts he pretended were not there. He had strong opinions that he wore like a scarf even in heat. The night the head turned toward him, he did not laugh. He got quiet in a way that made everyone else a little louder to fill the space. Sister Helena, Inês said. Rita's face softened. She worked with an order that administers estates when families want clean lines. She was firm and kind and knew the difference between a prayer and a warning. She said no to sales that felt wrong even when people pushed. Some resented her for slowing what they wanted. The night the head turned toward her, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. She made the sign of the cross and said that idols do not choose. Then she helped stack chairs. Inês drew the smallest circle around Helena's name. It was not reverence, only a way to tell herself who had believed what in a room that was built for belief. Who told the lies? Inês said. Not in public. Off the record. Everyone, Rita said. That is what bothered me. It was a game for some, a ritual for others. People confessed to nothing on paper and everything in tone. The owner liked to push someone into saying a thing that made the group lean in. The priest liked to see the leaning. The contractor liked to set the scene and bask in the attention. The adjuster rolled her eyes and made a note you could not read upside down. The evaluator smiled and said lines he would deny later. It was a circle of people who needed to believe that truth can be performed. Inês turned the pages Rita had brought. Each date had the same handful of names with small additions around the edges. A donor, a lawyer, a niece holding an old diary she could not read but wanted to sell. She wrote times in the margins. The first turn, the second, the third. The deaths came hours after each. The distances on the map looked small when taped to paper. They were an ache when walked in the dark. Who had the keys? Inês asked. And who used them without signing? The sign-outs show me, the curator, and one guard, Rita said. But the contractor sometimes took the case lid off during installation checks and said he would log it later. He is friendly until you ask him to be specific. He is less friendly then. Describe Vasco's interest in the doll before the first death, Inês said. He called it a stage with eyes, Rita said. He liked how the case reflected the room, how people could see themselves watching. He said art is a mirror and a dare. He wanted to mount a small motor to make a portrait breathe, as I told you. When I said the budget could not support that, he made a face like a child told bedtime is now. The interest changed after the first death. He started to talk about how the doll kept donors honest, as if fear were a kind of disinfectant. The waiter returned and asked if they needed anything. They did not. He left 2 small dishes of salted peanuts like another form of witness, and Inés did not touch them. Father Alvaro, Inés said, speak to me about him without his collar on. Rita tried, then shook her head. He is the kind of man people listen to even when he is telling a story about a chair. He uses phrases that carry decades of use behind them. He does not raise his voice. When he looks at you, you feel as if you have already told him more than you meant to. He blessed the room more than once, which is not standard for a museum. He called it goodwill. I called it something to write down and file in a drawer no one opens. Inés wrote a line under his name. Suggests confessional atmosphere. Directs talk toward truth moments. She did not draw a conclusion yet. She wrote notes that would let conclusions stand upright later. Where did they sit? She asked. At each meeting, who had the chair with the sight line to the case? Who stood by the light switch? Who drifted toward the corner with the best view of everyone's faces? Rita leaned over the map. Vasco floats. He moves to where the attention is as if it has a smell. The priest prefers the chair that faces the doll. He likes to look at it while he speaks. Tomas stands, mostly, near the door or the cord if something needs to be plugged in. Ana sits where she can see the donor's hands. Miguel liked the chair against the wall, so he could see the entire room and see who was seeing him. Inés drew a stitch of pencil toward the crown molding mark she had photographed earlier. A person on a ladder could lay a small sensor or mic array there and walk away, then return when the room was full and pretend he was only checking a vent. She had seen men do that in other rooms, other cases, other quiet schemes. We are going to assume a simple machine married to a simple hunger, she said. A beam of attention, a trigger, a small motor, a sound that gives guilt a shape. The deaths need hands that leave marks. We will separate who pointed from who pushed. Rita's gaze drifted to the door as if someone might be listening from the street. Do you think the owner chose the targets? I think he chose the moments, Inés said. Whether that makes him the chooser of the dead depends on who was waiting outside the museum each of those nights and what their agreement was. They finished at the cafe and walked the short distance to Anna's office. The adjuster space was neat without being cold. Files had tabs that looked like little flags planted in conquered hills. Anna stood to greet them, her face careful in a way that said she had already run the numbers on where questions would go. I heard you sealed the gallery, she said. I wondered when someone would do it. We are mapping people and times, Inés said. You have been at most of the after-hours events. Why keep going back? Anna sat and folded her hands. Because fraud loves gatherings dressed up as gratitude. If someone is going to sell a myth along with an antique, they like to do it in a circle with a glass in hand and a nod from the priest. The owner's salon is a fertile field. I like to be where a story might unravel. Who tells the biggest stories? Inés said. The owner tells the story of himself. The priest tells the story of moral courage. The contractor tells the story of how clever he is with wires. The evaluator told the story of discovery and quick profit until he could not. The conservator tells the story of time and patience. I tell the story of forms and limits. None of these are crimes until someone decides the stories must end in blood. Who carried a remote? Inés said. She kept her voice flat as a hallway. Anna smiled without humor. You think small, which means you think right. I noticed a flash in a cufflink on the second night. I did not have a reason to care then. Now I do. You will ask the owner to roll up his sleeves and you will find a little trick on the right one. They stepped back into the hall and the building smelled like dust and old air. Inés marked a small star beside Anna's name. Witness with eyes for devices. She called the station and asked for a preliminary pull on orders to local addresses for hobby servos, small radio receivers, microcontrollers, and battery packs. She asked for a name on the security company's incorporation and a list of its recent invoices to the museum. When she hung up, the tram bell shook the air again and a child somewhere laughed at the sound. Lisbon stacked its stairs and its stories as it had for centuries. The circle that kept meeting had used that old architecture like a mask. They had wanted consequence without handprints. The trick was never new. It only wore a prettier dress. Inés walked back toward the museum as the light softened to evening. She had her names, her map, her lists of who sat where and who watched from which angle. She had the image of a cufflink that gave a small pulse like a heartbeat someone else could hear. She had the sense of a room that had learned to make silence into permission. What she needed now was the hand that pressed the button and the hand that did not mind pushing a body when the city had gone to sleep. Find the operator, she wrote in her notebook. Then find the one who acted on the choice. Part 4. How the Doll Knows a Lie. Night returned the museum to its true temperature. The Casa de Alfama breathed in its own slow way when the last visitor left and the alarms took the room in their arms. Inés waited at the loading bay while the guard reset zones, then walked in with a case of tools, a warrant, and a calm that made people underestimate how quickly she could move when she had to. Rita met her at the gallery door with a key and a knot at the corner of her mouth. The curator stood farther back as if distance could grant deniability. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their radios low. Inés signed the seal, broke it, and let the hinges whisper the same tired note as before. They worked in a slow circle. The plinth still wore its taped dust cover where the access panel had been. The crown molding remembered the ladder. The extension cord lay where she had left it, unplugged and slightly accusing. Inés set a small kit on the cart and lifted out a handheld thermal imager, an infrared diode tester, a compact spectrum meter, and a wand that could sniff for radio noise without making a fuss. She did not ask the room to confess. She asked it to hum. The beam first. She lifted the thermal camera and painted the crown line in false color. Warm ducts, cold plaster, a thin spill of warmer air near a vent. She held the frame steady at the point where dust had been thin on the molding. A faint rectangle glowed like a bite mark that had not cooled because something else nearby fed it. She had a ladder again within minutes. A guard steadied the feet. Inés climbed and looked into the shadow that only exists where galleries meet ceilings. The molding had been carved to hold hooks and a rail. It now held something else. Nestled in the trough behind a scroll of wood, she found a thin bar no longer than her hand. Its face was featureless until she shone the light down it. Tiny black discs ran in a line like beads at the edge of a veil. They stood in groups that hinted at ears. Rita took the ladder when Inés stepped down and peered up. Is that a microphone array? It is, Inés said.
Beamforming.
It listens like a person who knows how to lean without moving. She photographed it in place and then eased it out. A ribbon cable tied it back to a small control unit that had been pinned behind the molding with 2 screws that were too shiny for the old wood. The unit fed a power lead that had been spliced into the case light circuit with the kind of care that says this is not my first time lying to a junction box. Back on the cart, the array looked like something a student would build for a competition. Off-the-shelf parts in a neat line. A control board with a processor that had been bored enough to wear a development kit sticker. Someone had told it to favor strong voices and map where they came from in the circle below. Why would you need direction, Rita asked, unless you wanted the machine to choose where to point? Exactly, Inés said. Loudest mouth, clearest path, more certain turn. She photographed the array, the screws, the splices. She logged the unit and the time. The room felt less like a shrine and more like a stage she could see from the wings. Now for the eye at the doll, she said. She moved to the urn that stood on a pedestal across from the case. It was an elegant piece in blue and white, a lid with a finial, the sort no one notices unless it is missing. Inés lifted the lid and, with 2 fingers, felt along the inside wall. Her gloves found a coin. She brought it out and set it on her palm. A flat disc, lacquered dark, no larger than a thumb joint. On one side a faint window, on the other a soldered pair of leads. When she turned it in the light, it winked the way a cat eye does in a headlamp. Infrared receiver, she said. It sees the click in the dark that the room cannot. Whoever placed it chose the urn because it faces the case without announcing itself. She looked into the urn again and found a thin wire leading down the pedestal through a hole that had been bored with a bit that did not respect porcelain. The wire ran under the rug and kissed the baseboard before slipping behind the plinth. Inês traced it to the cavity where the motor and radio receiver slept. The coin-sized eye fed that board. Another path from the crown mic unit reached the small processor that had been taped to the underside of the plinth shelf with a ribbon of double stick that had lost patience with heat. She slid the board free and read the part number off the processor. She had seen similar chips used in cheap voice assistants and smarter toys. This one had been configured to look for tremor and hesitation, the shallow markers of stress. It would not know truth from untruth. It would only feel a pulse where a boast faltered or a denial tightened the throat. "You made a gadget that listens for nerves," she said aloud to the room, and then waited for someone to give it permission to do what you wanted to do anyway. Rita stood with her hands at her sides. She looked as if she might apologize to the doll for letting a machine share its air. "I did not know about any of this," she said. "You found the motor," Inês said. "You told me. That is what matters now." She connected a battery from her kit to the plinth unit and watched the processor come alive. A small diagnostic light winked, then settled into a slow blink. She spoke a few words and let the array hear her. The blink quickened. She stretched a vowel, quickened more. When she raised her voice, the indicator hit a steady glow for a second and then fell back. It was the sort of crude test that does not prove anything precise and proves enough for an interview. Could it work by itself? The curator asked from his careful distance. No, Inês said. The board can flag a voice that sounds like a lie, but the turn follows a signal within a narrow window. The code is simple. A stress spike starts a 5-second timer. If an infrared pulse arrives before that timer dies, the motor receives a command. Turn 45 degrees, or turn 90 depending on intensity. That is why the felt under the neck ring has the worn marks at those angles. Whoever carried the clicker had to be watching, Rita said. They had to be within sight, yes, Inês said, and confident enough to press a button while people were laughing, or frowning, or praying. She held up her infrared tester and pointed it at the receiving coin. A tiny crimson dot bloomed on the tester's face when she pressed the trigger. A guard at the door flinched before he caught himself. The board hummed and the motor twitched in the cavity as if remembering its job. Inês cut power before the rod climbed. That proves the path, she said. Beam mic array listens and places. Processor flags stress and opens a window. A handheld infrared emitter presses its pulse. The receiver in the urn feeds the board. The motor turns the rod. The neck ring obeys. The chin touches the glass. The room holds its breath. Who used the clicker? The curator asked. His voice was calm and his eyes were not. The person who profits when fear is dressed as conscience. Inês said. The person who orders hobby parts under their own name because they think no one is looking, or under a company name because they think that is a mask. The person who likes to be the watchman and the host. We will confirm it. She bagged the coin receiver, the processor, and the array. She photographed the path of the wire where it disappeared under the rug and then lifted the edge to show the shallow groove someone had pressed into the cork floor to make the wire lie flat. The groove had been cut with a dull blade. A nick of cork clung by a thread. She plucked it with tweezers and bagged it too. Cheap work leaves crumbs. She powered the plinth board again, but this time she clipped a small logger between the receiver and the motor. The device would record any future infrared pulse it saw, alongside a stamp of time and, if the emitter carried a signature, the pattern of its modulation. Some hobby remotes broadcast a fingerprint without knowing they do. She hid the logger under a strip of wood and documented its presence in her own notes, not on any form that would be photocopied at the desk. We let it sit, she said. If someone tries another turn, we catch their hand in the light they cannot see. Meanwhile, we ask for receipts and shipments. We ask for browser histories and orders placed late at night. We ask to see a gentleman's cuff. Rita closed the case and set her palms on the lid as if blessing a patient after a difficult test. Do you think the doll knows anything? She asked, not quite smiling. Beyond balance and the weight of a look. It knows how to make silence dense, Inês said. The rest is us. They left the gallery under a new seal. Inés walked the corridor with the quiet of someone who has collected enough facts to stop a story from pretending to be a myth. The night smelled like salt when she stepped into the courtyard. A tram clanged 2 streets over and a dog barked once as if agreeing. She called the station and requested a purchase sweep. 2.4 gigahertz receivers. Micro servos with high torque for their size. Tiny lithium cells. Beam-forming microphone bars. She added voice-stress software plugins to the list, the kind hobbyists use when they think they have discovered human nature with a download. She gave 2 names for priority polls, Vasco Lamy and Tomas Villar. Before hanging up, she added 1 more instruction. Flag orders for novelty cufflinks with electronics or custom jewelry mounts shaped to hold a small diode and coin cell. A silence on the line that meant the clerk was picturing it too. When she cut the call, she looked back at the lit window of the gallery and saw only her reflection in the glass. The case would sit through the night pretending to be empty of intent. The plinth would cradle a simple heart no one had meant to admire. And somewhere a man who liked to push moments toward spectacle kept a small device in a drawer the way some people keep matches and others keep photographs. The machine did not know truth. It knew tremor and timing. The person holding the clicker knew what he wanted the room to think. Inés let that thought settle. She would find the clicker. After that, she would find the person who translated show into harm. Part 5, the 4th night warning. The gallery reopened under a polite lie. A small card near the door said private event. The staff laid out glasses and thin biscuits that turned to dust when touched. The doll sat in its case with the same patient angle as before. The plinth, sealed again, kept its secret heartbeat under tape and wood. Inés stood near the back wall and let the room fill. The owner arrived first, as if the air had sent him an invitation. Vasco wore a jacket that fit like a plan and cuffs that caught the light. He greeted each arrival with a hand on the shoulder that did not quite feel like welcome. The priest followed, sleeves neat, expression gentle the way a tide is gentle until the rocks remember it. Anna came with a folder tucked under her arm and a face that could listen without agreeing. Tomas drifted in carrying nothing, like a man who tells himself he is only passing through a story, not building it. Rita hovered near the case as if she were the doll's interpreter. The curator watched the door and the clock in equal measure. The guards took their posts and pretended to be furniture. Inés could feel the circle form the way heat gathers before a storm. Vasco opened his hands to the room. He spoke about stewardship and the honor of holding history for a night. He used words that dull fear without taking anything away. He let silence sit, then filled it with the sound of wine touching glass. Father Alvaro said a few sentences about truth-loving light. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Even the hinges seemed to listen. The talk drifted toward insurance. It always does when property and desire share a room. Someone asked whether water damage counts when a pipe fails in an old house. It was a casual question passed across the circle like a ball no one expected to drop. Anna answered because she was the one who knew how to read the fine print when it did not want to be read. She said the policy would not pay for an accident described in the way the owner had just described it. She said it kindly. She did not look at anyone while she said it. She might as well have touched a nerve in a tooth the room did not know it had. That was when the sound came. Dry. The head moved. It did not move fast. It arrived where it meant to go. The angle of the chin found a new arc on the glass. The room went quiet in a way that made every breath sound like a decision. The face, with its eyes that only knew polish and paint, pointed toward Anna. She stood as still as the case for a count of 3, and then let her mouth flatten in a line that would not be called fear. She looked at Vasco and then away. Vasco tilted his head as if acknowledging applause. Inés did not step forward. She watched. She let the moment hang long enough to teach her how it liked to swing. She noted the position of each person's hands. She noted the way the guard outside the door leaned in without moving. She noted a flash that had no right to be there. It happened in the chrome of a frame on the far wall. For the smallest slice of time, the glass showed a pinpoint of light near Vasco's right wrist, where the cuff met the hand. It was not a reflection from the overhead fixture. It had direction. It had intent. It was gone the next heartbeat, the way a match is gone when someone decides the flame has done its job. Inês felt her own breath shorten and made it long again. She did not give the room any oxygen beyond what it needed to keep people from fainting. The talk resumed. People said things they would pretend meant nothing. The curator poured more wine. The priest said a line about conscience that sounded like the last sentence of a sermon given to an empty nave. When the gathering broke, Anna left with her folder and 2 messages on her phone that she did not play for anyone. Vasco stayed long enough to make sure his presence continued when his body did not. Tomas lingered by the door and looked at the cord that had been unplugged and did not reach to plug it back in. Rita cleaned the rim of the display case where someone had breathed too close in line with the arc of the chin. Inês waited. She wanted the room to return to the museum it pretended to be. When it had, she stepped to the plinth, lifted the taped cover on the access cavity, and connected her tablet to the logger she had hidden in the wiring. The little screen showed a new entry: time, strength, pattern. 4th activation, she said to herself. The board had seen an infrared pulse inside the window the stress algorithm opened. It had recorded the modulation signature of the emitter. It did not give her a name. It gave her a fingerprint. It was enough. She asked a guard to pull the alarm panel logs for the evening. The event had been cleared as private, and the alarm for the gallery zone had been disabled on a temporary code. The timestamp aligned neatly with the moment the head turned. When people think they are in charge of fear, they like to tell systems to stand down. By the time she walked into the night, the city had folded itself back into its usual curves. The tram side uphill. A woman laughed 2 streets away. A man cursed a dog that did not care. Inês took the steps down to the river level and called the station. She asked them to send a car to Anna's address with a simple request dressed as a courtesy. We would like to ask a few follow-up questions before morning. She wanted presence near Anna without declaring alarm. The call came back an hour later. Not from the car she had sent, but from a neighbor who did not know he was about to be a witness. He said water. He said running. He said a door not quite closed and a voice in his head that sounded like worry. The patrol was 5 minutes behind him. Inês was 3 minutes behind the patrol. Anna's building wore its age the way stone wears rain. The stairwell smelled of soap and pipes and the garlic someone had cooked for dinner and then forgotten to own. Her door had been pried without elegance. Splinters along the latch. Small marks from a flat tool. Inside, the bathroom sang the dull song of a faucet left to do too much. Anna lay face down in the tub. The water had gone lukewarm, which is the temperature the dead cannot feel. The patrol officer had turned off the tap without asking her first. He said he could not stand the sound. Inês nodded because she had thought the same thing before he said it. The neighbors stood in the hall and made small prayers they would not remember later. The body told a simple story first. No sign of a struggle in the room beyond the latch. No overturned chair. No bruise from a fall. A faint chemical trace at the edge of a washcloth. The kind of sweetness that belongs in an old medicine drawer, not in a life. She told herself to wait for the lab to put a name to it. She wrote the word sedative because the nose is a better detective than pride admits. A glass bottle lay on the sink. It had left a ring of water like a clock that only knows 1 hour. The windows were closed. The steam had softened the paint near the ceiling. Everything in the room had a wet sheen that makes fingerprints sigh and disappear. Whoever did this had counted on water to be a cleaner with no conscience. Inês worked through what the scene offered. A scuff at the hinge where a shoe had lodged for balance while someone leaned in. A short blonde thread on the bath mat that did not belong to Anna, whose hair was dark and tied back with elastic. A smear on the door jamb that would turn out to be the simple gray of building dust mixed with the oils from a handyman's hand. Men who pry doors make those marks when they move in a hurry and call it care. She stepped back into the hallway and asked the neighbor to tell her how long he had heard the water. He looked at the floor while he answered, as if the answer might be written on the tiles. Long enough, he said, for me to think it was a leak and not a life. The car that had gone by the museum earlier brought the alarm logs to her phone. The gallery zone had been off for 3 hours for a private event. Re-enabled when the last donor stepped into the night. The new activation recorded by her hidden logger sat inside that window like a bead in a groove made by a thin blade. The line she could draw now was not an inference. It was a path. She went back to the museum and asked for the external camera feeds that looked across the street. She did not want faces yet. She wanted light. She scrubbed the footage frame by frame across the moment the head turned. In the reflection on the chrome frame that hung on the far wall, you could see a small brilliant point near the owner's right wrist. You could freeze the frame and the point would still burn in your eyes like an afterimage you bring home from watching an eclipse with the wrong glass. She took that image and printed it. She took the logger entry and printed it. She took the alarm log and printed it. Paper has weight that arguments cannot dodge. She folded the 3 sheets and slid them into her notebook. At her desk, she wrote the plainest line she could find. 4th activation recorded while gallery alarm disabled for event. Infrared pulse detected within stress window. Reflection shows small flash at owner's right cuff. Anna Mora found deceased in bath. Probable forced drowning after forced entry. Tool marks consistent with flat pry. Chemical odor suggests sedative. She put her pen down and let her hand rest. The room felt quiet, the way rooms feel when a machine stops that no one had noticed running. She knew what she would do next. It would not be a raid. It would be a conversation conducted with gloves and a warrant. It would be a request for sleeves to be rolled and a drawer to be opened and a screen to be handed over without time to be cleaned. The doll had pointed. The city had taken another body. The machine inside the plinth had listened and obeyed. The hand in the cuff had asked it to. The hand on the door at Anna's flat had done the rest. The line between those hands had been drawn in water and light. Inés picked up her notebook and drew it again in ink. Part 6: bodies, residues, and an old smell. The morgue smelled like bleach and a memory you cannot name. Inés stood at the stainless table while the pathologist read notes in a voice meant for facts. The sheet did not move except where the air from a vent stroked it. Miguel lay with his mouth slightly open, as if about to object to a bill. The pathologist touched a gloved finger to the tongue. It had the dark, bruised look of a bad promise. Along the edges, near the crack lines, a faint red-brown halo had dried. "That is not blood alone," he said. "There is iron, but there is also pigment. The crystals are too uniform for chance." He had taken scrapings and made slides that shone under a lamp. Inés looked down the scope. The particles were small and angular, the color of rust on a careful day. "Iron oxide," he said. "The kind used to fake age on paper or wood when a client wants time to show without patience." Inés thought of the tint room at the museum, the cloths kept in a drawer, the jars labeled in the hand of a person who did not believe labels were a threat. She wrote 2 words. "Transfer cloth." She asked about the cause. The pathologist kept his eyes on the facts. Asphyxia due to airway compromise. Severe lingual edema. There are marks consistent with pressure at the jaw hinge. A tourniquet at the base of the tongue could do this. Or a choke with a gel pack to distribute force. It is ugly but silent. He showed her photographs of faint ligature compression around the neck and a small bruise that matched the curve of a thumb set just so. Behind the ear, the skin carried a smudge that did not belong to the room. Gray and fine. Building dust. He did not drown, the pathologist said. He suffocated on his own swelling. She thanked him and stood a moment longer. The dead do not answer. They offer you residue and a silence that can feel like scorn if you are tired. From the morgue she went to the lab where fibers and powders learn new names. A technician handed her 2 reports. The first spoke about a cloth found in the museum's tint room. The second spoke about the residue taken from Miguel's tongue. The pigment matches, the technician said. Same iron oxide variant. Same simple binder. We also found traces of gum arabic on the cloth. Whoever handled it had used it recently. The cloth fibers contain saliva. Saliva, Inés said. We cannot say whose, but the contact is fresh. Less than a week. Inés saw a hand pressed against a mouth that tried to shout and could not. The cloth tasted like iron and old paper. It left a stain that would not admit to being a stain. She walked the back stair of the museum at dusk, when the building let its second voice out. The steps were stone set by people who liked Corner Square. At the landing, a patch of light revealed something that swept misses when people hurry. A sprinkle of glass dust glittered like a secret. She knelt and touched the grit with a swab. Under the swab, the dust was fine, almost a powder, more from a cut edge than a broken pane. On the lower steps, she found 2 scuffs that made a pair. One sliding heel, one planted toe. Duarte fell after a struggle, she wrote. She bagged the swabs and took a wash of the handrail where fingers leave opinions. In the corner, at shoulder height, the paint had a smear no one would call paint. It was skin oil carrying the pale gray of wall dust, with a thread nested in it. The thread was short and stiff, synthetic, dark. She took it to the lab herself and watched the intake form catch the light. Shoe treads on Duarte had already told a story. A pattern in the dirt that matched the make of boots worn by a certain list of men. She had asked Tomas for his boots, and he had smiled like a man who believes inspectors never learn to lace. The lab had lifted skin cells from under Duarte's nails. There had been a name in the certificate that came back. Not in ink. In alleles that look like a barcode a person thinks he left at home. She stood on the pier where Duarte had died and let the wind bring her the smell of salt and diesel. The water slapped the wood with a tired hand. The glass dust on the stair would match the dust ground into the leather of his shoes. The thread from the stair wall matched a thread from the cuff of a jacket that hung in Tomas's locker. A jacket with a rip half mended. The scene with Sister Helena asked for a softer step. The convent's gate was iron and the paint had resisted rust without pretending it could do it forever. The sister in charge led Inés to a small room where the dead woman's habit lay folded on a chair like a person who had been told to wait. Inés lifted the sleeve of the habit with 2 fingers and breathed in. Linseed oil and rosin, in the ratio conservators use when they dress threads with a light touch. The mix lived in the weave like a polite guest. It also lived in a smear near the cuff where a hand had grabbed and the oils pressed deeper. Rita stood beside her and did not touch the cloth. "That is our mix for the doll's dress," she said. "I made it last month. We keep the jar labeled and we date the batch. I was careful. I thought I was careful. You were," Inés said. "Someone handled the dress after you. Someone left a trace on Sister Helena when they pulled her by the arm. Or when she touched the dress and then someone pulled her away." They looked at the photographs from the street where Helena had fallen. No one had seen a shove because no one believes a shove looks like a shove when a woman in black loses her balance on a curb. A bus stop advertisement smiled behind her in the picture on file. A shadow near the edge had the shape of a shoulder that did not stay for a name. Back at the lab, a second technician lifted a lid on a box of swabs. "We found this in the sleeve hem," he said. "A splinter the size of a comma. It is oak, French oak, with a heat bloom in the grain." Inés thought of the barrels in the cellar of another case she had read last year and set the thought aside. Here the oak belonged to a chair in the museum. The doll's chair had a scar along the back where a bracket had rubbed. A little piece had come away. A hand that grabbed a sleeve near that back might catch a splinter and carry it into cloth. She asked the technician to match the oak to the doll's chair. He said it would be a pleasure, and in his mouth pleasure sounded like the honor of catching someone who believed wood does not tell on a man. The water in Anna's bath had taken what it could. It had also failed to wash away everything. The latch on her door had been pried with a flat tool. The tool was not expensive. The mark it left was the same mark on a practice door in a storage room at the museum where Tomas kept his kit. She found a bottle in his locker that had once held chloral hydrate. The label was old. The contents were not. He had wrapped the bottle in a cloth with the logo of a security company stitched in a corner. The company had one client for special events in the last month. The museum. Inés sat with these pieces at a table in the station that had seen enough coffee rings to resemble a topographical map. She laid out the photographs as if dealing cards in a slow game where the rules change and then settle back into place. Miguel's tongue with iron oxide crystals. The tint room cloth bright with the same red-brown dust. The tourniquet band found later in a rag bin with DNA that did not belong to the dead. Duarte's shoes with glass powder ground into the seams. The stair scuffs. The thread. The cells under nails and the name they sang. Sister Helena's sleeve with the linseed and rosin print. The oak splinter that did not grow in a habit. The pry marks on Anna's door. The bottle that carried sleep. The bath that required hands. She called the pathologist again and asked about the pattern of pressure on Miguel's jaw. He said he had measured. The points aligned with a grip where a right hand holds the chin and a left hand carries the tool. The gel pack was not found. That is because it melts, he said. People who plan to leave nothing prefer ice made of chemical. She called the lab and asked whether the oak splinter had found its family. It had. The chair welcomed it back in the way wood welcomes itself. The match lines were true. She called a contact in the permit office and asked for records on the gallery's alarm settings for private events. The events matched nights of turns. The officer on the line said something about coincidence and then stopped because his own words sounded like mercy. Late, in the tint room, she stood alone. The jars on the shelf held colors that pretend to be time. She opened the one marked iron oxide and let herself smell the dry metallic tang. Old smell, she wrote without meaning to. Not because the jar was old, but because the scent reaches back into rooms where people made paper look older so a price would rise, or a donor would feel that history had kissed their hand. She picked up the cloth from the evidence bag and held it above the jar without touching. The color was the same under two kinds of light. The weave carried grit in its pores that looked like a small desert. She could see where a palm had pressed and left a map. She put the cloth down and stood a long time by the doll's case. Behind glass, the figure kept its fixed tolerance for human plans. The angle of the head was wrong for prayer and right for listening. The plinth remembered her logger and kept its own small counsel. She had enough to say that the gallery was not only a place of display. It was an armory stocked with what a person needed to make harm feel like a story. The pigments stained. The cloths muffled. The stair caught feet. The chair bit. The door welcomed the flat tool that had done the job before. Nothing here killed by itself. Everything here made killing easier to dress in ritual. On the walk home, she thought about a sentence said to no one. People build devices when they want distance. They build rooms when they want an audience. They build rules when they want forgiveness to look like judgment. The doll did not know any of that. It knew weight and balance. It knew the dry click a spring makes when a small motor tells it to speak. At her desk, she wrote the lines she would need in the morning. Physical links connect each death to materials from the gallery. Iron oxide pigment on Miguel's tongue matches cloth from tint room. Glass dust on Duarte's shoes matches stair landing. Skin cells under his nails match Tomas Villar. Linseed and rosin residue on Sister Helena's sleeve match dressing used on the doll's conserved dress. Oak splinter in sleeve matches chair under the case. Anna's latch shows flat pry tool marks matching tool from Tomas's kit. Bottle with sedative found in Tomas's locker. She closed the notebook and let the room settle. The old smell of iron stayed with her a moment longer. Then it went, the way smells go when the mind decides it is time to be clear. Tomorrow would be questions in a red room. Tonight, the city listened without turning its head. Part 7, Interrogations in the Red Room. The interview room had red walls that a previous chief had chosen to make people feel warm and then unsettled. The color took the light and returned it in a way that made even honest faces look like they were thinking about a better version of the truth. Inés preferred plain rooms for her own work, but the red room had history. People underestimated themselves here. She set a glass of water on the table and a small recorder the size of a matchbox beside it. She checked the clock and the line of questions she had written by hand. She did not plan to be clever. She planned to be steady. Vasco came first because he would expect to set the tone. He walked in with a lawyer 2 steps behind him and a scent that could have been a cologne or the memory of a gallery opening. He smiled the way hosts smile to quiet a room before their speech. "Thank you for coming," Inés said. "I am a friend to the institution," he said. "If the museum hurts, I bring a bandage. If the police need clarity, I bring light." He sat. The lawyer nodded at the recorder. Inés read the date and time and the names for the tape. She did not ask Vasco to place his hands on the table. She waited until he did it by himself, then looked at his cuffs. "We are securing evidence from your gallery," she said. "We found an electric motor mounted inside the plinth of the doll's case. A steel rod rises from that motor into the chair and links to a brass ring at the neck. A small processor listens to the room. When stress in a voice spikes, it opens a window. If an infrared pulse arrives within 5 seconds, the head turns. The receiver that sees that pulse sits inside an urn facing the case. We found a beam-forming microphone mounted in the crown molding to favor the circle of guests. The mechanism logs each activation. There are 4. Vasco sipped his water. I host conversations about art and ethics, he said. If someone hid a toy inside a plinth, I would be the victim, not the author. Inês slid a photograph across the table. Caught a bright point near a right wrist at the moment the head turned toward Anna. She placed a second sheet beside it. A simple printout of a log line. Time, strength, pattern. Infrared pulse detected within the window. We also found practice targets in your office, she said. Heads on a turntable with marks at 45 degrees and 90 degrees. And our external camera caught a flash at your cuff when the doll moved. Performance studies, he said smoothly. I research how an audience receives a gesture. I am a gallerist. I test ideas. Lift your sleeves, she said. The lawyer touched his client's elbow. You can refuse. Vasco measured the moment and decided to be generous. He unbuttoned his cuffs. The right one resisted. The face of the cufflink had a small seam. It turned and came free in his fingers, dragging with it a disc that could pass for a jewel to anyone who did not know what diodes look like when dressed for dinner. A coin cell sat behind it like a secret he had been told to keep only while the party lasted. Where did you get these? Inês asked. Custom work, he said. A gift from a collaborator. I do not carry remotes. I carry ideas. She bagged the link and noted the skin mark it left at the wrist. The little circle of irritation that told her he wore it often and pressed it more than once. The lawyer asked whether his client was under arrest. Not yet, Inês said. She thanked them and asked them to wait outside. Rita came next. She held herself like a person who had watched a door for too long. She sat without touching the water. You found the motor after the first death, Inês said. I did, Rita said, and I did not report it. I thought if I told the board there was a mechanism in the doll's plinth, we would lose the collection. We live on fragile budgets. I told myself I would watch. I told myself it was a prank that would embarrass someone into stopping. Why did you keep attending the after-hours gatherings? Inês asked. Because I thought if I was there I could limit the harm. That is arrogance dressed as duty. I see that now. Did you ever see a remote in Vasco's hand? No. But I saw him watch the room the way a conductor watches a section he has warned once. I saw his eyes when a lie hovered. He looked like a man waiting to press a doorbell. What about Tomás? Inês said. He installed cameras like he was setting traps he wanted to be thanked for. He flirted with the idea of being essential. He likes to be a man who opens the back of things. He told me once he could lift any lid in the building if he wanted. He said it like a joke. I smiled like it was one. Inês slid a form across the table. It listed the charge of evidence withholding next to a note about cooperation. She told Rita plainly what the consequences could be and what the path might look like if she continued to be exact. Rita did not argue. She only nodded, which sometimes counts as bravery in rooms like this. Tomás filled the doorway like a man who owns his shoulders. He sat with his legs wide, as if making space was a form of claim. He looked at the recorder and grinned at it. We have your boots, Inês said. The tread pattern matches the dirt on the stairs where Duarte fell. We have skin cells under Duarte's nails. They match your profile. We have pry marks on Anna's door that match your flat tool. We found a bottle of chloral hydrate in your locker. The label says an old pharmacy. The contents say you shop for modern needs. He shrugged. I do work where people panic about things that go bump in the night. If I was near a fall, it was because I check alarms. If I own a pry bar, it is because doors stick. If someone drowned, it is a tragedy of a bathroom in an old building. You cannot lay every misfortune at my door because I know how to use a toolbox. Inês pushed a photograph of Miguel's jaw across the table. She put a second photograph of the tourniquet band beside it. The pressure marks show a right hand under the chin and a left with a band at the base of the tongue. The band we recovered has your sweat on it. The cloth in the tint room has saliva on it and iron oxide pigment that matches what we found in Miguel's mouth. Tomas stared at the pictures. He did not reach for them. He did not flinch. His eyes hardened and then narrowed in a way that meant the room had lost its friendliness. If I say I was paid to scare people, he said, and that things went too far once, does that make the host innocent? Who paid you? He looked at the wall as if it had an answer he preferred. He lifted a shoulder. The gallery has one person who writes checks without asking permission. He said the word person as if it were a title. Did Father Alvaro ask you to do anything? Inés asked. The priest asked for silence in rooms not built for it, Tomas said. He likes to watch a confession begin. He did not hand me tools. He handed me moments. Maybe that is worse. They stopped for a break and let the red walls cool. The priest came in last, his collar neat, his face open in the way practiced patients can be open and still hide a ledger behind it. We have recordings, Inés said. At your gatherings you asked questions that bent conversations toward confessions. You praised courage when a donor admitted a doubt. You frowned when denial sounded rehearsed. The moments you chose align with the turns of the doll. Money flowed from a foundation connected to your parish to the security upgrade at the gallery. Tell me about your role. He folded his hands. In that small movement there was a stage and a pulpit and 1,000 rooms where people had told him things they could not bear alone. If my presence made men and women soften their grip on their lies, he said, that is not a crime. People bring idols to me and ask me to bless them. I tell them blessings do not change the nature of wood or porcelain. If the owner wanted fear to police vanity, I told him fear is a poor policeman. I did not ask anyone to die. Inés placed a transcript beside his water. It was a voicemail pulled from Vasco's phone. The line was brief. Point it and let God finish it. The priest read the words and closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were older. I believed a little theater might make the proud reconsider, he said. I did not imagine blood would climb the stairs behind us. That is my failure. Name it what you need to. She told him he would be charged as an accessory to intimidation pending review. He nodded once. He did not argue. He asked whether he might notify his superior. She said yes. Outside, the hall held the sounds the red room edits away. Phones, shoes, a machine that makes bad coffee. Inés stood with her notebook and drew a simple shape. A circle labeled owner. A line to a smaller circle labeled clicker. A line to a block labeled contractor. A line to a shape labeled X. A dotted line to a triangle labeled priest. Atmosphere. Rita waited on a bench, hands folded. She looked at Inés as if permission were a thing to ask for and not a thing to take back from a room. Inés told her they would recommend a reduced charge for cooperation and honesty. Rita nodded again, the same quiet yes as before. Inés walked back into the red room and placed the cufflink on the table beside the photograph of the flash. She put the logger printout beside it. She set the tourniquet band and the pry bar photograph in a neat line. She did not arrange them for drama. She arranged them for how a file would look when a stranger opened it in a court with daylight instead of red walls. When Vasco returned with his lawyer, she let the silence sit until he tried to fill it. He said the word performance again. He said experiment. He said context. He said no one can prove that a small light at a cuff is more than a toy. Inés leaned forward just enough to reach the line she had chosen for this room. The doll turned when you pressed, she said. People died when Tomas moved his hands. The priest pushed talk toward the cliff. You built a show that made harm feel like judgment. You can call it art. I will call it solicitation and conspiracy. The lawyer asked for a recess. Inés granted it. She signed for the cufflink and the practice turntable heads and the invoice that tied both to an order number in Vasco's browsing history. She signed for Tomas's boots and the bottle in his locker and the extract of his phone location at each death. She signed for the voicemail. Paper gathered and thickened like a storm. When she stepped out of the red room, the air in the corridor felt cooler and thinner, like the city outside had leaned its shoulder against the building and exhaled. The next step was the cufflink and the clicker, not as theory but as a device tied to a name and a time. After that, She would close the space between the hand that pressed a button and the hand that held a head underwater. Press Vasco on the flash. Squeeze Tomas on the stair DNA and the pry bar. The next part would be evidence with edges. The circle that liked to meet would learn what circles look like when drawn by law. Part 8, the cufflink and the clicker. The warrant read like a polite invitation written by someone who knows how to end a party. At 9 in the morning, Inés walked into Vasco's office with 2 uniformed officers and a technician who treated just the way a banker treats signatures. The space had good light and expensive indecision. Shelves of art books that had never been opened far enough to crack a spine. A glass desk that reflected every move as if asking whether the room approved. Vasco arrived with a key and a smile that had learned nothing from the Red Room. He produced a short speech about cooperation. Inés listened to none of it. She handed him the warrant and asked him to stand where he could see the desk and not touch it. "We begin with your top drawer," she said. The technician lifted a velvet tray as if removing a curtain. Cufflinks sat in pairs like small masks waiting for a face. Most were harmless metal with the sort of ambition jewelry has when it wants to be called timeless. 2 in the back were not. They had smooth faces and tiny seams. The right one carried a diode set behind a dark window that would pass for stone if you did not bring a light to it. The left one carried a coin cell mounted in miniature claws and a paper-thin switch hidden in the hinge. Inés lifted each with tweezers and set them on a clean square of foam. The diode link's face rotated with a crisp click and revealed the small optical element a hobbyist would be proud of. She did not smile. She noted tiny scratches near the edge where a thumbnail had worried the piece open and closed more than once. "We will test modulation," she said. She connected a reader that could listen to the infrared pattern when the cufflink spoke. A number scrolled into life on her tablet. The signature had the hesitant regularity of a person learning a metronome. It was not random. It was a fingerprint made of light. She laid the printout from the gallery logger beside the tablet. The numbers matched, columns lined as if relieved to see each other again. Vasco's lawyer said that infrared codes are common. Inés nodded. Then she read the unique carrier frequency the custom diode was tuned to and the slightly asymmetric pulse width that the logger had captured because cheap boards do not make perfect squares. Imperfection can be a gift. The signature was his. She moved on. Middle drawer. Receipts. The kind of thin paper that wants to fade before a judge can read it. Orders from a warehouse store no one goes to unless they are building things that fit in a palm. Micro servos with higher torque than their size deserved. 2.4 gigahertz receivers. Shrink-wrapped decks of lithium cells. A handwritten list in a loopy confidence script. Stress voice plugin. Beam mic array. Infrared modules. The list had ticks beside each item like a grocery accomplished. Bottom drawer. A small wooden turntable platform with a head silhouette affixed to it. Angle marks at 45 degrees and 90 degrees burned into the wood with a hobby iron. The silhouette's jaw had faint rub marks where a finger had tested the pause that sells a moment. Explain this, the lawyer said, before his client could volunteer performance again. Research into audience perception, Vasco said with his practiced warmth. A gallery should be a laboratory for feeling. We test how a gesture lands. We are not barbarians. The technician held up a plastic case from the back of the drawer. It contained spare diodes, micro switches, and a spool of fine insulated wire. The case smelled faintly of rosin and impatience. A small bag inside held cufflink faces without their mounts, as if someone had practiced pressing the window into the metal and gotten bored before polishing away the evidence. The office computer asked for a password. Vasco supplied one that would have embarrassed a teenager. The browser opened on a history full of curiosity that had spent itself late at night. Search strings for voice stress analysis software. Tutorials on beamforming microphones for small rooms. Threads where men with usernames instead of lives swap tips on hiding electronics for race day pranks. The logs showed 2 purchase sessions that coincided with the month the doll began to turn. The addresses matched the gallery and a private box in Vasco's name. He had not tried to hide the trail. Concealment is a different art from curation. He was a curator of effects. The technician cloned the drive while Inés worked through email. One chain read like choreography. A jeweler in the business district talking to a client about a commission. Weight no more than 5 grams. Face must rotate. The piece must pass through a metal detector without singing. The reply from the jeweler had an attachment with a diagram. A cufflink wired for a small signal disguised by a decorative cap. The jeweler had signed with a flourish people learn when their parents loved their name. "We will visit him," Inês said, and pocketed the printout. On a shelf that wanted to be about sculpture, she found a box labeled with a brand that speaks in lowercase to look friendly. Inside, practice targets. Head silhouettes printed on card. The angles marked in pencil. Notes in the margin. 90 feels theatrical. 45 feels like judgment. Her skin prickled at the banality. People think harm announces itself with horns. Mostly it orders supplies and writes margins. When the sweep was done, she walked Vasco through a simple truth. The cufflink in her bag showed the signal that matched her logger's record. His drawer held the parts. His browser held the path. His receipt held the dates. His turntable held the angles. His room had watched people become prey. "I staged a conversation," he said when she finished. "If I pushed a button, it was to frame a moral lesson. Your outrage is quaint. You should thank me for the honesty I inspired." She thought of Miguel, who had died with iron on his tongue. She thought of Duarte and the scuff on the stair where someone planted for leverage. She thought of Sister Helena and a sleeve that carried a splinter like a comma the story could not shake. She thought of Anna face down in a tub, water speaking the least poetic language in the world. "You pointed," she said, "and then someone did the part you did not want to be seen doing. That second part is called killing. We do not thank men who set the table and ask others to carve." The jeweler confirmed what the diagram had already told her. He remembered the commission because it was clever and because the client had paid in cash with a tip size to erase curiosity. He had mounted the diode and the coin cell and the hinge switch. He had tested the beam through a tinted window and laughed when it still bit the sensor on the wall across his shop. Inês took his statement and left him with the kind of quiet that follows a thrill when you realize it was not a trick but a tool. Back at the station, the analyst compared the modulation pattern from the cufflink with the signature caught on all 4 nights the head had turned. The match was boring in its steadiness. People believe their improvisations make them untraceable. Consistency is the gravity that defeats them. The analyst wrote a sentence with numbers stacked like stones, and Inês slid it into the growing file. She assembled the set on a table for the prosecutor, who liked cases that looked like a puzzle with no extra pieces. Cufflinks, receipts, screen captures, practice heads, logger printouts, the reflection photograph that spared the court the problem of imagination, the laser pointer signature, the jeweler's diagram, the invoices for the beam mic array and the plinth processor under a pseudonym that had rented itself on a mailing list. Each item had a line to a date and a person. The prosecutor tapped the cufflink with a pen. "He can argue art until his throat gives out," he said. "We have solicitation and tampering at minimum. We can add reckless endangerment tied to the pattern of deaths and the fact that he knew the mechanism created targets for a known violent actor. We will tie him to conspiracy when we show the money, and we will show the money through transfers to the contractor." "What about the man with the hands?" "Tomas," Inês said. "We will close his circle next. The pry bar, the bottle, the location pings, the fibers and the glass. He is made of axe. He will not stand up to weather." She walked home with a folder thinner than the truth felt and thicker than the lies had imagined. In the window of a shop that sold saints and candles, a porcelain face watched the street without moving and did not ask to be part of anyone's lesson. In her notebook, she wrote the lead out in the small disciplined letters she used when she did not want emotion to tilt the page. Operator identified and linked to device by unique infrared signature, purchases, and custom jewelry. Mechanism and input path proven. He can point the doll. But who killed in the world beyond the case? The next part would answer with hands, with tools, and with the unromantic grammar of force. Part 9, the knife, the bath, the fall. Morning made the station look almost honest. Inês stood by the evidence board and watched a line become a net. Pins touched places that had not known each other before. The river. A stairwell hung between floors like a held breath. A bed where a man had bitten his own tongue and found no air. A bathroom where steam had written a small cloud on the mirror and then left. She began with Duarte because falls are supposed to feel like accidents. The pier still smelled of diesel and river metal. She walked the boards again with a scene tech whose head tilted when the light told a secret. 2 meters back from where Duarte had gone over, they found a coin of scraped wood that matched a heel pivot. Farther in, at the waist-high rail, a faint scuff ran horizontal where a knee had pressed for leverage. The pattern matched the rubber on the toe of a work boot with a chevron tread. At the lab, the chevron owned a brand too cheap for counterfeits. Tomas wore that brand. The soles of his boots carried a mix of cork dust from the museum floor, glass powder from a stair landing, and a grit from the pier that held a trace of diesel film. The glass dust in his boot seams matched the handrail smear on the museum stairs. Under Duarte's nails, cells made a barcode that said Tomas in a language alleles speak without caring who listens. The gloves that sometimes keep a man anonymous betray him by thread. Tomas kept nitrile in his kit. He also kept a pair of cheap fabric gloves for cold nights. Fibers from the inside seam of those gloves were in the cuff of Duarte's coat where an elbow had been grabbed. A bruise on Duarte's upper arm had the flat edge signature of a thumb set for push instead of pull. The lividity pattern in the body told the story a tripod cannot tell. He was held enough to be guided before he fell. Miguel's room had been staged as a late collapse. A broken glass, a dropped phone, a chair askew. The chair had no scrape marks on the floor where it would have slipped if a man had flailed. The rug held the clean circle of a gel pack that had sat long enough to melt into water. The tourniquet band from the rag bin at the gallery had a sweat profile the lab liked for Tomas. The iron oxide on Miguel's tongue matched the tint room cloth. When Inés pictured the act, she saw a right hand under the jaw, a left hand tightening a strip at the base of the tongue, and a cloth pressed over the mouth to stifle reflex noise. The teeth cracked on a bite against a pressure he could not name in time. Anna's door had given up its measurements without protest. The pry marks fit the flat bar in Tomas's kit with a comfort that made denial look like vanity. On the bathroom counter, the glass bottle that had held chloral hydrate wore a fingerprint smeared by water and rescued by luck. The partial agreed with Tomas's left index enough to make a prosecutor breathe easier. Residue at the drain was the same compound. Thinned. A washcloth near the tub lip held the faint perfume of it. The tub itself offered nothing polite. It offered the plain weight of a body held, face down, while water did the only thing it knows how to do. Phone records make liars efficient. Tomas's handset had gone to sleep near the museum on nights when the doll had turned. After the gatherings it woke and walked through cell sectors that led to Duarte's fall and to Anna's flat. On Miguel's night it slept again within 100 meters of the evaluator's address and then went silent for a span that ended in a different sector, as if a man had learned which towers watched and which looked away. Inés did not arrest him in a hallway full of noise. She brought him back to the red room, laid the photographs as if dealing hands, and let the table look like it had been waiting for him. "We can account for your feet," she said. "We can account for your hands. We can account for your tools. We can account for your phone when it went quiet and then woke. You will tell me you maintain security and test alarms and dislike doors that stick. You will say a pier is slippery and a bath is an accident in a city with old pipes. I will say a bruise does not care what story you prefer." He stared at the tourniquet band and then at the photograph of Duarte's arm. He said nothing for a long breath that left the room short. Then he said the owner's name without honor. "He promised a contract," Tomas said. "He said I was part of the art, that the city needs a lesson in truth, that donors lie and buyers lie and only fear wakes men who like a mirror. He said the doll was a frame to hold a moment. He told me to make sure the moment had weight. He did not give you a list of names," Inés said. "He gave you a mood. You chose who died." Tomas's jaw made a small movement like regret wanting a place to sit. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of the table as if looking for a splinter to carry out. He said the priest wanted a show that made people sit up. He said a certain man earned what happened on the stair because he had cheated a friend. He said a drowning looks like grief to a coroner who is in a hurry. He said nothing that sounds like a command and everything that sounds like a dare. How much did he pay? Enough to make a year feel short, Tomas said. Enough to make me think I could buy a different kind of work after this. I told myself I was scaring scavengers. I told myself I would stop before the line. Then the line moved and I did not. Inés did not offer comfort. She offered a pen and a form. While he signed, she sent a team to his workshop locker. They found the flat pry bar with its stubborn polish of building dust. They found a knife in a roll with a short, heavy blade used to cut cable ties and tape cleanly in a hurry. The blade had a nick that matched a scratch on the inside edge of Anna's latch. Evidence is a habit. It leaves calligraphy for those willing to read. They also found a slip of paper folded small. On it, a bank transfer code. The sender was a foundation with a pleasant name connected to cultural improvements. The account officer, when pressed with a warrant and a call from a prosecutor who preferred direct routes, tied it to a parish fund. The memo line for one transfer was a single word that meant security in Portuguese and could also mean quiet. The priest did not hand you tools, Inés said to Tomas. He handed you a moral frame and then looked away at the moment a man needs someone else to look at him. Tomas did not disagree. He said the priest's voice could make a lie sound heavy. He said his own hands made it permanent. He did not cry, which would have been a form of vanity here. He did not ask for a bargain. He asked for a light to be turned off, which Inés did not do. She took his phone and ran the maps again. On Miguel's night, a short detour behind the museum showed on the record. A dead zone where a man might wait by a service entrance for a guest who had said too much to a doll. On Duarte's night, a pause at the top of the back stair. 5 minutes of nothing. Then a descent through sectors that led to the pier where the river tells stories the living do not write. On Anna's night, a path that curled through 3 streets like a rope thrown from a window, then straight to her building and a stop outside her door long enough to learn its protest. She added the lab's fingerprint lift to her file. She added a technician's note that the pry bar's width and machined edge matched the door scars within 0.5 millimeter. She added the bottle identification. The chloral hydrate bottle had come from a closing pharmacy's old stock, purchased for cash a year ago by a man who had signed a ledger with the name of a company that did not send a person to pick it up. The clerk remembered the buyer because he had said the bottle was for an antique display and had asked whether the liquid inside would stain the glass. When all of it sat on the table, the prosecutor leaned back and let himself breathe to the bottom of his ribs. "We can charge murder 3 times, he said of Tomas. "We can add attempted murder for Anna if we need to sequence the filings. We can add conspiracy, burglary, and a small garden of tampering. For the owner, we have solicitation and conspiracy and tampering. We have the device, the purchases, the custom cufflink, the money to our contractor, and the accessory priest who dressed the room." Inés nodded. The priest would stand on a charge that said he had made a threat sacred by adding theater. He would insist on intent. She would insist on effect. There was a voicemail that did not pray. There were bank lines that did not absolve. There were words said in a room a microphone had loved. She went to the chapel in the station because she wanted to look at a room built for silence that asks for nothing back. A chair in the corner had the shine of a hand that had gripped its top rail while waiting for a decision. She did not sit. She stood and thought about the doll, which had never known prayer and had been asked to play judge anyway. On her way out, she passed Rita in the corridor. The conservator held herself straighter than she had in days. She told Inés the jar of iron oxide had been logged out twice without a form. Once on the day the evaluator died. Once on the day Inés had come to look at the cloth. The signatures were 2 names written by the same hand. She did not need to say the name. Inés had seen that hand on practice notes with angles marked for effect. In the hallway outside the red room, Tomas waited under a guard's eye. He did not look up when Inés passed. He had chosen a point on the floor and fixed on it, as if the point might turn its head and choose him. She did not give the moment any poetry. She let paper do the speaking. Back in her office, she wrote what the file already knew. Phone location for Tomas places him at each scene near the moment harm was done. His glove fibers and skin cells sit in the dead man's story. His tool bit the living woman's door. His bottle made her weak. His hands made water fatal. His boots walked glass and cork and diesel. Payments moved from a foundation tied to the priest's circle to Tomas, labeled for security. The cufflink in the owner's desk matched the light in the photograph and the number in the logger. The owner trains a machine to point. The contractor pushes men and holds heads. The priest supplies the sermon. With operator and enforcer identified, the conspiracy is whole enough to lift. Keep one eye on the priest's part and one on the device. The next move is to set a night where the doll turns for the last time and the hand that tells it to leaves its name where light can read. Part 10, The Priest and the Room That Listens. The parish office smelled of paper and lemon oil. A window gave out to a square where pigeons made soft comments and a man tuned a guitar to a note that was always a little ahead of the hour. Father Alvaro sat behind a desk that held a small crucifix, a chipped mug, and a ledger bound in green that had absorbed years of careful numbers. He looked as he had looked in the gallery, composed without effort, as if the chair had learned his shape. Inés placed a recorder on the desk and a folder beside it. She read the date and time. She said the names. She did not use the room's softness for anything. She let it live and kept her own voice playing. "We have recordings from the gallery," she said. The beam microphone above the crown molding captured fragments of your voice at each gathering. You steer talk toward moments you call truth. You praise a confession when it is small, and you frown when a denial is large. The pattern of your interventions aligns with the moments the mechanism opened its window. He nodded once. "A conversation needs a rhythm," he said. "If someone is going to say a difficult thing, a prompt can help." She slid a transcript across to him. It was not long. A voicemail taken from Vasco's phone and reduced to black letters on white space. "Point it and let God finish it." He looked at the line as if it were a proverb he did not recognize and then closed the page with careful fingers. "I believed fear might be a tutor," he said. "I did not imagine it would hire a killer. That is not defense. It is confession to a smaller wrong inside a larger one." "We have money," she said. "Transfers routed from a foundation managed through your parish to the gallery security upgrade. From there to the contractor. The memo line uses a word that can mean safety or silence. If this were only an audit, I would call it sloppy. Because this is an investigation, I will call it a path." He turned the crucifix slightly so its base was square to the ledger. "The foundation is real," he said. "It pays for repairs no one will fund. Roofs, locks, sometimes a dehumidifier so books can breathe. The gallery asked for help to make donors feel that their gifts were protected. I do not install devices. I sign checks when the account allows. Later, I stood in rooms where I wanted people to tell the truth. Those two facts now hold hands in a way that shames me." Inés opened the folder. Inside were still frames pulled from the beam microphone's memory. They were not pictures of faces. They were timestamps and power levels. Spikes when a voice tightened. Spikes when a joke ran too far and broke. She placed them beside a list of dates and the bank transfers that walked toward the same nights. "Your counsel was not neutral," she said. "You chose moments. You praised courage when a liar's voice shook. You told a room that listening was holy while a man across the circle had a remote in his cuff and another man outside the door had a pry bar in his bag. You did not order deaths. You prepared the table." He did not raise his eyes. He kept them on the ledger. When he spoke, his voice was the same voice he had used to bless a room. In the line between a warning and a threat, he said, "I stood too far from the warning. I thought I was making a theater that would scare a cheap back to honesty. I did not account for a host who wanted to be the judge and a contractor who wanted to be necessary." The door to the office opened and a woman in a sweater leaned in to ask about a food delivery for the shelter. He answered her with a kindness that made the room feel smaller and then closed the door again. Inés waited. Kindness in one corner does not erase a harm in another. "We will charge you as an accessory to intimidation," she said. "We will present the money path and the voicemail and the recordings. We will argue that you fostered a climate where fear was an instrument and where others wielded it as a weapon. We will also note your cooperation and the absence of your hand on any tool." He nodded. "I will answer for my part," he said. "If there is penance outside of prayers, I will take that too." Inés stood and walked him through the formalities. He placed his hands on the desk when asked, not as surrender but as assent. She left the office with the ledger open to a page that listed repairs in the language of roofs and hinges and pipes. The square outside held a pause in the day. The guitar found its note. The pigeons agreed. Back at the station, the analyst printed a network map. Names sat in nodes joined by lines that carried money, presence, or influence. The priest's node did not touch the axe directly, touched the room, touched the owner, touched the fund. Inês liked maps because they give a lie fewer places to hide. She taped the page to the board beside the photograph of the cufflink flash and the logger printouts and the lab certificates. The wall looked less like a puzzle now and more like a plan. She visited the gallery once more before night. The case watched her with the same practiced indifference. She stood in the circle where the chairs had sat and spoke aloud a sentence she wanted the room to remember. Objects do not judge. People build clocks for their fear and call it truth. The guard near the door pretended not to hear and then nodded to himself because he had. In the tint room, the jar of iron oxide sat on a shelf with its lid screwed down. Inês lifted it and rolled the granules with a small shake. She put it back and picked up a blank label. She wrote a date on it and a word. Withheld. She stuck it to the side of the jar and left it there as if the room needed its own confession. She met the prosecutor on the steps, where the light turned the stone warm. He asked about the priest. She gave him the line she would use later in a room that did not hold saints. He did not wield tools, but he tuned the room. He chose moments that aligned with harm. He moved money that paid for wires and boards. He blessed a theater that pretended to be conscience. The prosecutor nodded and looked toward the tram as if expecting it to deliver a verdict with the evening crowd. We charge him as accessory to intimidation and to conspiracy in spirit if not in statute, he said. A court can sort the boundaries. Jurors do not like men who push and then call the shove a nudge. Inês went home and sat at a small table that had held her notebooks for years. She wrote the part of the report that is more spine than muscle. Recordings show the priest's voice guiding talk to confession triggers. Bank records tie his foundation to the gallery's security, that included devices installed to support the pointing mechanism. Voicemail to owner instructs use of device. He denies knowledge of murder but accepts role in intimidation. Recommend charge. Accessory to intimidation and material supporter of environment used to commit subsequent offenses. She read the pages back to herself the way she had taught herself to read a scene, slowly and without granting mercy to a sentence that wanted to be pretty. The language held. The facts bore their own weight. Before she slept, she stood at the window and watched the hill right its lights. Lisbon knows about rooms where people tell stories in the dark. Fado bars, back kitchens, stairs where voices carry to neighbors who have learned not to lean too hard on walls. The little museum had wanted to be a shelter for objects and ended as a school for fear. Tomorrow they would make the last turn and let the mechanism write its last log with a name attached. She closed the notebook and set the pen across it to keep the place. The city breathed. The room listened. The doll in its case did not move at all. Part 11, the night of the last turn. They dressed the room as if for another donor talk. No flyers, no list, an evening window on the alarm schedule that looked like habit rather than plan. The doll sat where it always sat, steady in its glass. The plinth had its heart rewired. The processor remained, but Inês had added a quiet witness in the path between the eye and the motor. The logger would now take more than time and strength. It would take the shape of the signal, the interval between pulses, the breath of a device that did not know it was leaving a name. Rita placed a textile on a stand near the case and kept her eyes on the floor when she was not speaking. The curator poured wine with the concentration of a man who does not want to spill. 2 guards became furniture again. 1 officer in plain clothes played a donor who had worried about a policy. Another officer became a bored guest near the door. Inês stood behind a column, still enough to be mistaken for part of the room if someone had been careless with their eyes. Vasco arrived in a dark suit that made the rest of the room choose a lower key. He smiled as if rehearsals pleased him more than premieres. He rolled his cuffs back 1 notch while he spoke to a friend and then rolled them forward again. It was a habit he had not noticed in himself. Habits are where the hand reaches when the mind tries not to. Tomas did not enter. He had learned to wait outside, where a tool bag makes more sense than a glass. A pair of officers caught his reflection in a window across the street and the tilt of his head that meant alertness disguised as loitering. He looked at his phone twice, and both times the light from the screen made a small square on his face like a stage mark. Father Alvaro did not come. Inés had not invited him. The room already had enough gravity without a sermon. A volunteer from the museum sat in his usual chair and kept silence. The talk began with the conservator's measured sentences about fiber and patience. It moved, as it always did, toward the subject that interests a crowd more than thread count. Insurance. Responsibility. What happens when water does what water does? The officer planted as a donor asked a question with the right mix of innocence and provocation. Will a policy ever pay for a leak if the owner waits to fix the pipe? Vasco tilted his head, listening for something only he could hear. He glanced at the doll the way a magician glances at the box that hides the rabbit. He said a few words about stewardship and the need for vigilance. He waited for a denial to appear as if it were a bird. The officer offered it, flat and clear. A leak is an accident. That is what the contract says. It should pay. The beam array would have heard the edge in the officer's voice and lifted a flag in the small processor. The window opened for 5 seconds. Inés watched Vasco's right hand. He raised it without raising it, the way a man adjusts a cufflink when he does not need to. His thumb found the seam and pressed. The dry sound came. The head moved. It took its time and arrived at the angle marked long ago by a finger on a practice board. The chin found glass. The room paused. In that pause, the small witness Inés had placed between eye and motor drank the signal and wrote it down. Not just the carrier and the pulse width. The tiny irregularities. The stutter a craftsman had built into a hinge to make room for a coin cell. Inés stepped forward and did not raise her voice. She addressed the room as if this were a rehearsal too. The demonstration is complete, she said. We have recorded the device identifier from your cufflink, Mr. Lamy. We have captured your infrared signature on this turn and on the previous 4. Officers will now take possession of the device on your wrist. You are under arrest for solicitation, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. Vasco's smile did not fail so much as it lost its job. He looked at the doll and then at Inés as if asking for a cue he had misplaced. He started to speak the word performance and stopped when an officer's hand touched his elbow with the kind of courtesy that removes choice. At the same moment, outside, Tomas reached for his bag. The plainclothes officer near the door moved. 2 more came from the corridor as if they had been standing in the paint all along. They took the bag and the man. Inside the bag lay a flat pry bar, 2 cloth pads sealed in plastic, a bottle with a label that had started life in another decade, and a knife with that same short, heavy blade which does not glitter when it should not. The chloral hydrate bottle's cap bore a fingerprint the lab would later bless with a name it already knew. Inés detached the back panel of the plinth in full view of the room. She did not need to expose the motor to know it would sit still under a new seal like a heart that has signed its confession. She disconnected the processor and the beam array and the receiver coin. Each went into a bag. Each bag received a label. Each label bore a date and a time and her initials with the steady small line she used when she wanted to be slower than adrenaline. Vasco spoke again, at last, something about a lesson in truth, something about how fear makes people clean. Inés did not answer him. She looked at the face under glass that had never been anything but a surface for people to project themselves on. She said to the room, not to him, that objects do not judge. People do. People choose. People press. They took Tomas down the hall where lamps buzzed like insects. The bag with his tools went another way, into a box that would close on it as if the wood had opinions. The officer who had played the donor sat and let her breath go the way a person does when a scene stops pretending. Inés walked the short distance to the security office and checked the alarm panel. The event window blinked as scheduled. She turned the gallery's zone back on with a code that would make the system note her hand. It felt like closing a door in a house that has decided to be home again. At the station, the small witness from the plinth showed its work. The signature from the cufflink taken off Vasco's wrist matched the signature from the moment the head had moved. The logger held 5 entries now. The 4 that had ended in bodies and the 1 that had ended in a pair of cuffs. The analyst printed them on a single page so that even a person who hated numbers could see what a match looks like when it does not bother to hide. The prosecutor looked at the page and tapped the line that would bring a jury to silence. He will talk about art and you will talk about signals and device identifiers and money and bodies, he said. The court will know what story to believe. Inês wrote the closing lines for the night. Controlled event. Mechanism restored to baseline with hidden logger added between receiver and motor. Staged prompt delivered within beam mic field. Infrared flash captured in reflection and by logger. Device seized from suspect's cuff. Signature match confirmed across events. Secondary actor apprehended outside with tools and sedatives. Both gave statements. The circle is closed. She went back to the museum once more before dawn. The guard on duty looked relieved in a way that does not need words. In the gallery, the doll's head held its angle toward a corner that did not matter. The case reflected a woman in a dark coat who let her shoulders drop an inch because work had turned from stopping a harm to writing the part that explains it. Outside, the tram made its first climb. The city cleared its throat. Inês stood for a moment in the threshold and then pulled the door until the latch spoke its small metal certainty. Final part, the doll that chose the liar. The charge sheets made a stack that did not wobble. Paper can mislead when it is thin. When it is thick, it is usually earned. The prosecutor read counts in a voice that had learned to keep its own weather. For Vasco Lamy. Solicitation to commit violent acts, conspiracy, tampering with cultural property, obstruction by device. For Tomás Villar, 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, conspiracy, burglary, possession of a controlled sedative for the purpose of assault. For Father Alvaro, accessory to intimidation, material support to an environment used to commit subsequent offenses. For Rita Figuera, evidence withholding, with a note on cooperation and the recommendation of a reduced disposition. They signed the chain of custody forms until the ink turned ordinary. The cufflink went into a box with a number that would outlive fashion. The plinth's radio board and motor and coin receiver lay in their anti-static sleeves like insects pinned for study. The beam-forming bar from the crown molding had given up its memory and now looked like nothing at all. Inês walked each piece of the case one final time, not because she doubted the whole, but because endings deserve a last straight look. Miguel's tongue with iron oxide crystals. The tint cloth salted with the same pigment and the trace of saliva. Duarte's fall told in wood and glass dust and the angle of a knee at the rail. Sister Helena's sleeve carrying linseed and rosin from the doll's conserved dress. And the oak splinter that fit the chair's scar as if would knew its own name. Anna's bath, the pry marks that matched the flat bar in Tomas's kit. The bottle that sang chloral hydrate even after the water tried to hush it. Phone logs that walked the contractor from event to act. Money lines that tied a foundation to a security upgrade that was never about comfort and always about control. At arraignment, the owner wore dignity like a coat a degree too warm. He tried to speak the word performance and found that the room did not care for metaphors. The judge had questions about intent, agency, and the difference between imitation and instrument. The cufflink signature sat on the overhead, 5 entries in a neat column that did not know how to blush. The defense said coincidence. The numbers said repetition. The jury did not need the rest explained. There would be a trial. It would be long enough to test patience and short enough to respect the dead. Tomás pleaded with the economy of a man who finally sees the size of his shadow. He spoke of money and dare and the comfort of doing what you are good at even when good is the wrong word. He did not claim redemption. He did not ask for forgiveness from a room that cannot give it. He spoke the owner's name because it belonged there. He spoke the priest's because omission would have been its own lie. He did not look at Inês when he finished, which she appreciated. Some men try to spend apology like a currency. He did not. The priest stood in a different courtroom later, the one where the charge does not carry the heat of blood but carries the weight of a room misused. He did not argue the transcripts. He did not dispute the line between warning and threat that he had stepped across while telling himself the step was pastoral. He said he had believed fear could tutor pride. He said fear, when hired, becomes a bully. He accepted the finding. He asked to keep saying Massachusetts. The court did not answer that question. Another authority would. Rita brought her notebook to Internal Affairs and set it on the table as if laying down a fault and a promise not to repeat it. She spoke through the failure and the fear that had made her keep silent. She named what she had done after the silence. Photographs, calls, testimony. The board that governs small museums in a city of old stones and thin budgets read the letter Inês wrote on her behalf and decided that contrition plus diligence would do more good than punishment alone. Suspended, then reinstated, then moved to a bench no one else wanted, where textiles from a school in need of mending waited for a patient hand. It was not absolution. It was work. The Casa de Alfama collections closed the gallery for 2 weeks. The publicity said maintenance. The reality said exorcism of wires. Inês signed a form that allowed the motor to be removed and catalogued. The plinth was remade as plain wood. The crown molding lost 2 shiny screws and regained its dust. The urn that had held the little eye went back to being a container for air. They put the doll away without ceremony. Storage is the opposite of theater. White gloves, blank shelves, the light level a low constant that flatters no one. Rita wrote a new note on the object card. Head angle fixed by gentle restraint. Mechanism removed as evidence. Display suspended pending board review. It was the sort of sentence no one puts on a brochure and every conservator respects. When she sealed the box, she rested her palm on the lid for a breath, not for the sake of the porcelain, but for the sake of the room that would be quiet again. On a morning that belonged to no one, Inês walked the museum before opening. The courtyard tiles were still cold. The guard at the desk lifted a hand and let it fall, a small salute to routine. In the cleared gallery, the plinth stood empty under glass that had been cleaned until it made the room feel larger than it was. She stood at the case and watched her own reflection soften as the light deepened. Nothing pointed, nothing chose. Felt like honesty. She thought of the circle that had liked to meet here. How a joke becomes a ritual because it gets applause. How a machine becomes a judge because someone decides to say it is one. How cities learn and forget and learn again the lesson about fear dressed as conscience. She had the line she would keep, written in her small hand in the file, and now said to the quiet air, "Objects do not judge. People build clocks for their fear and call it truth." On the steps outside, a tram ground up the hill and clattered past the window. A woman laughed 3 streets away. A man cursed softly when his dog refused the stairs. The city preferred not to notice itself, which is its grace. Inês took out her notebook one last time and wrote the final report spine. Each entry a rung on a ladder you climb down once the rescue is done. Charges filed. Devices seized and catalogued. Financial path established. Mechanism demonstrated under controlled conditions and signature captured. Confessions recorded where given. The doll returned to storage without electrics. Plinth made plain. Gallery reopened with nothing to press and nothing to fear except the usual human appetite for shortcuts. She closed the book and watched the light tilt on the tiles. The case would move through court now, through schedules and continuances and a ritual of its own. She would testify when called, in sentences that had learned to carry weight without leaning on flourish. The doll would sleep in its box and wake only when a future board decided that looking at it did more good than harm. Perhaps never. Perhaps in a different city years from now, under a title that admitted how close people like to stand to the line between play and punishment. At the edge of the courtyard, a child pressed his face to the glass of a different case and breathed a fog onto it. His mother pulled him back with a whisper. He laughed the laugh that proves nothing will ever be perfectly safe and nothing needs to be perfectly dangerous to be worth keeping. Inês let herself smile. She had work to do, and then she had coffee to drink under a sky that did not know her name. She took one last look at the empty plinth and turned away. The room, relieved of its borrowed authority, looked younger by a decade. The door closed with a click that was only wood and latch. No omen, no judgment, only a promise to hold what is given and to let go when asked. End of story. If you've stayed with us this far, through glass cases, quiet rooms, and voices that mistook performance for truth, thank you. You've just heard The Doll That Chose the Liar, a story about how fear can dress itself in porcelain and still find a human hand to wind the key. Our investigator, Inês Amaral, leaves the case behind, but not the question it raised. When a lie turns deadly, does the machine or the believer pull the trigger first? Here at Somnolent Conspiracies, we hold the light steady for stories that listen back. If tonight's tale stayed with you, if you caught yourself watching the corner of the room just to be sure, then our work has done its part. Now, before you go, take a breath, unclench your jaw, check the locks, but don't worry too much about the ones on doors. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending your time with Somnolent Conspiracies, where every whisper, every quiet detail, and every sleepless truth finds its echo. If you'd like to keep exploring the shadows with us, remember to subscribe, tap the bell, and leave a like. Your support keeps the light on and the stories breathing. And until the next case unfolds, sleep lightly, listen closely, because every shadow has a story, and we'll be here to tell it.